This playlist organizes the sections that comprise the lecture on moral relativism, specifically talking about the chapter that we've read from Rachel called The Challenge of Cultural Relativism. Now, I'll use slightly different terms than Rachel's in some cases, and I'll cover the topic in a slightly more comprehensive way. So I'm going to start by talking about a bunch of different positions, and I'll summarize those positions and their relationship to each other using a table. Then I'll look at the argument that Rachel considers for what I call meta-ethical moral relativism and his three strategies for countering meta-ethical moral relativism. His claim that the argument in favor of the position is invalid, his claim that the argument in favor of the position has false premises, and his argument against the position itself. So let's start by looking at the terms that I want to cover in the next segment of the lecture. So here are the terms that we want to talk about. We'll start with descriptive moral relativism. And descriptive moral relativism is just a name for a collection of factual observations about the moral practices of various cultures, both during a particular time and across time. And descriptive moral relativism essentially asserts that moral practices can vary significantly with regard to some particular action across time and across cultures. That's just an observed fact about ethical practices in cultures, and across times. Next, we'll turn our attention to what I call meta-ethical moral objectivism. I call it meta-ethical because it's a view about the nature of moral judgments, about how ethics should look and how ethics should guide our actions. And so it's about ethics. And specifically, meta-ethical moral objectivism will want to claim that our moral judgments, our ethical judgments, are in fact objectively true or objectively false. There are things about the world that do not vary from one culture to the next that render our judgments either true or false. Meta-ethical moral objectivism has a normative counterpart, that is, a view about what follows if meta-ethical moral objectivism is true. And specifically, normative moral objectivism claims that the way in which we ought to regulate our behaviors in the ethical sphere is by adhering to these true objective norms, using them to guide our behavior once we discover or reach consensus about their truth, which can be determined. The next view that we'll look at is called meta-ethical moral relativism. And again, this is a view about the nature of our moral judgments. And meta-ethical moral relativism asserts that the only way in which we can understand ethical judgments as being true or false is by relativizing them to a culture. And specifically, it claims that things like shared moral values, conventions, past practices, histories, perceptions of the world, these sorts of things that are all relative to a particular culture or a group of individuals are what determine whether or not the ethical judgment that you make is true or false within that culture. So truth becomes relative to the specific context in which the judgment is being made. Meta-ethical moral relativism has a normative component or implication, and that position is termed in the lecture normative moral relativism. Normative moral relativism gives us a theory about how we should try to guide our behavior in the ethical sphere given the truth of meta-ethical moral relativism. And essentially, it claims that we should guide our behaviors in light of the moral and ethical judgments that are true within the cultural context in which we are acting. In other words, it might be legitimate for us to say commit murder in one culture, and we should use that norm to guide our actions, and it may be illegitimate for us to commit murder in another culture. The very same act against the very same type of individual in this different culture, and therefore we should not engage in that activity in that culture. Finally, we have those positions that we talked about earlier in the arguments lectures. Meta-ethical moral nihilism is a view about the nature of our ethical and moral judgments, and specifically it says that there are no facts, either facts relative to a specific culture or objective facts that render our judgments true or false, so that there is no truth or falsity about our ethical and moral claims, about our norms or principles. There is just the world without those ethical and moral properties at all. Meta-ethical moral skepticism is a companion view, and it simply claims that we could never know what the correct moral judgment regarding some particular kind of action would be, or for that matter, what the incorrect moral judgment for some particular action ought to be. We can't know these things because there aren't facts for us to know, and so it's a skeptical position. It's an epistemological position about what we can know. And finally, we have normative moral nihilism. And normative moral nihilism is the normative companion to meta-ethical moral nihilism. And essentially, normative moral nihilism says that we can't legitimately use true ethical or moral judgments or rules that might be contained in those judgments to guide our behavior, because there are no true ethical or moral judgments. There are no true moral principles that we can use to regulate our behavior. In the next segment, I'll talk about the arguments and responses that Rachel considers in this chapter.